Hi there, and thank you for joining me on this identity and confidence workshop for young people with cochlear implants. My name is Stuart McNaughton, and I am a registered psychotherapist here in the UK. But before we begin, I want you to take a look at me. I want you to observe me. I'm going to give you a few seconds to just sit with any thoughts or feelings you may have. Now, normally this exercise is better done in person, and normally the room would be full of adults, and this is a safe space. And normally I would ask you what you see or what you noticed when I walked into the room, when you saw me for the first time. Now, depending on who you are, you might see me as a white privileged male. You might look at my head and think, wow, being bald really works well on him. You might feel sorry for me because my cochlear implants are so visible. I know, however, that there are things that you might have thought about me that you would rather not share, and for whatever reason. And this is what we call your psychodynamic blueprint. Now, I want you to remember that term throughout this presentation, but I also want you to keep a record of anything that comes up for you, because you might want to talk it through with somebody. So today we're here to talk about identity and confidence. So let's start with a brief discussion about identity. When doing this presentation in person, I would normally put you into pairs or into small groups. I would ask you to introduce yourselves and ask each other, what is identity? What do you think identity is? Now, before I provide a summary of what can form our sense of identity, it's worth explaining how identity may be formed. When a child observes you observing others, they are picking up on what you might be thinking or feeling. When a child gazes into their mother's eyes, they are incredibly attuned at picking up any distress that mother has. Research tells us that until the age of about 2, children introject everything that their parents project. And they need to, because without you, they cannot survive. So before a child is 2 years old, they are literally an extension of you, your beliefs, your values, your routines, even your very anxiety. And this is why in my work, I also work with the additional worries that parents may be having. Now, research suggests that from the age of 2, a child starts to experience shame. Okay, so prior to the age of 2, parents expect a lot of crying. They're on call for when their child poops and giggles, when a child is running around without their clothes on. But after the age of 2, when the nappies start coming off and parents start insisting that children wear clothes, young babies are learning a new sense of what is right and what is wrong. And this is why toddlers tend to resist. And when they start speaking, some of you will know they start to question everything. Now, what's happening here is they are forming their own sense of self. As a child continues to grow, especially from the age of 7, children become more conscious of their difference. Now, this can be anything from height to race sexuality, gender, disability, even socio-economic differences. Anything that might be considered different from the norms seen in their household or extended family. So between the ages of 2 and 11, an identity is continuously being formed. But there's more to come. There may be political opinions, there may be moral attitudes, and also religious beliefs, which an individual may have influenced by family and other influential people in their life. Later on, identity also comprises the roles we adopt as parents, as teachers, professionals, even our nationalities. So as you can see, identity has got many layers. So identity isn't fixed and it can evolve over the course of our lives. So try to think of your child as an onion. Over the years, they are being formed, they're being nurtured, and they're being influenced. They're being shaped. Now, on this slide, you can see some aspects of identity. There are probably many, many more that you can add to this list. Now, I want you to look at these 4 pictures. What do you see? Yes, I know it's me at different ages, but what do you see? Now, when I normally present this face to face, there's a silence, like a confusion. But we can see from these photos that my parents tried their best to make sure that my disability remained invisible, even during the many years that I wore hearing aids. We know that they were probably trying to protect me, but how does a child interject that? Remember that psychodynamic blueprint we were talking about earlier? Anything in my parents' psychodynamic blueprint, and in this case, perhaps their fears for my future, will be projected onto me. But how I or any child in a similar situation interjects that can be quite harmful. So why are we talking about this today? You won't see me promoting the banks very often, but what HSBC said here is so true. As parents of children with hearing loss, you are responsible for the nurturing of a child who is different. But the truth is we are all different. We have to be mindful that your child simply isn't like you in one of these very fundamental of ways. And so many children with hearing loss grow up not really understanding themselves. And how can they if they were never truly understood? From the previous slide with those 4 photos of myself at a younger age, what you may also be unconsciously doing is projecting onto your child. And this might not be right for a person with hearing loss, because the more a child, indeed any child, is expected to behave a certain way, and in some cases I have seen parents wanting their child to be more like a hearing child, what will happen is the child will become more inauthentic and they will grow up needing to please, developing those people-pleasing tendencies for a quiet life, or resorting to conflict in a bid to be understood. Now, as much as we want our children to be like us, and to stay close. Autonomy must always prevail, because this allows them to reflect on their own evolving values. And this is important, because if they feel empowered enough, this can spark change and a more fulfilling life for them. Now, over the years, I've worked with many families, and I love this photo. I think it's a great photo. And I've worked with many families and young people with hearing loss. And the theme of identity crisis is a common one. Indeed, I remember my own. I remember going to bed at night as a young child, fearful because not only could I not see in the dark, I could also not hear. I was always worried there was a monster in the house. And later on, I remember my dad trying to heavily influence my career options by encouraging me to study subjects that were bound to get me a job as a postman, for example. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a postman, but even in my teens, I wanted to strive for more. So what my dad was doing was he was merely projecting his fears onto me, believing, not unreasonably, that I might not be able. Now, you probably have similar experiences from your own growing up. How many of you felt misunderstood by your parents? Conversely, I remember my mum refusing to let me go into an interview to work for a local supermarket. She believed that I was capable of so much more. And that one intervention in my life at the age of 16 changed my career. It changed my career so much so that I wouldn't be doing what I do today and having this presentation now with you. This is the power that you as a parent have, and when exercised well, can massively impact the life course of your child. Now, we all know that the demands on parents have changed so much since I was at school. For example, we didn't have both a virtual self and a real self to contend with. As young people dedicate more and more time to their online persona, they become more disappointed with who they really are. Now, when I started my own personal therapy many years ago, I identified 36 different selves. Who was I around my mum? Who was I around my dad? Who was I around my colleagues? Who was I around an intimate partner? Who was I when I was publicly speaking? Who was I when I played sports? All of these scenarios bring out different dynamics. And the idea of therapy is to integrate as many of those as possible so that we can be more present and more authentic. Now, young deaf people struggle with this because they endured a childhood where their own family can't really know what it's like to be deaf or hard of hearing. How many of you have asked at some point in your life out loud or to yourself, who am I? Or what does the future hold? Now, these are very existential questions. Why are we here? Now, anyone who is different or has a sense of difference growing up will have additional questions such as, am I good enough? Why am I this way? What's happening to me? Why is this happening to me and not to other people? Now, since identity is formed in the mind, I was hoping that I could share some theories with you. So it is worth mentioning Freud, one of the most famous psychoanalysts. In one framework, Freud proposed that the mind was comprised of three things. One was the id, driven by instinct, by desire, so basically our urges. And then there's the ego, which figures out what it wants. And then there's something called the superego, which is driven by morality and by values. All those things that get projected onto us, all of the things that we've introjected over a lifetime of teaching, discipline, even the laws of the land. So let me give you an example. I might get an urge for sugar. So the id is saying, I need sugar. And then I go in search of chocolate. So the ego has identified how to satisfy the id. When I have the chocolate, I'm looking at it and I can hear a voice in my head that says, if I eat this, it's not good for me. Now that's the superego talking. The ego will ultimately decide between the two. So when it comes to chocolate, my ego is actually quite weak. So I always cave in. Let's use an example in a young person with cochlear implants. A 9-year-old girl who has cochlear implants really would like to go to a friend's birthday party. But some of the other girls have been teasing her. They've been teasing her about their cochlear implants. So we know that in the superego, a set of negative beliefs have been building up. Stuff that she's introjected. The ego is assessing whether or not going to the birthday party equals a risk of more teasing and decides not to go. The parents insist, saying it would be antisocial not to go. The 9-year-old girl protests and starts acting out, and the parents are left confused as to why. Now, normally in a face-to-face situation, I would ask the audience, what do you think should happen next? Okay, so this can be quite an engaging discussion, and it's really centered around focusing on why the child is in distress. Now, much of the angst is coming from the core beliefs that we've developed as we grow. Some are helpful, many are not, and these can be challenged using cognitive behavioural therapy. So it's important to find out what your child believes. This is critical in helping everybody to make sense of what's playing out here. Now, in the scenario that I've given, if parents were to force the child to go into an environment where they feel there's a risk of bullying or there's a perceived risk to their own safety or well-being, there is a risk that we are re-traumatizing the child. So it's better that we understand what core beliefs the child has and then work with those. So let's look at an example of core beliefs. So we have a child who is praised by teachers for doing really well with their grades. The parents then do the same thing. The child therefore naturally develops a core belief that they are worth something only if they do something well. With this, the child is developing what is known as a very external locus of evaluation. So the child is using things external to them to evaluate themselves. So the child is thinking, because I've pleased my teachers and my parents, I'm therefore a good person. Now, the issue arises later in life when a child is experiencing some difficulties and they go to the other end of the spectrum and feel absolutely worthless because nobody is validating them, which can result in all kinds of behaviours from acting out all the way through to self-harming and potentially worse. So what might be a good way of preventing this external locus of evaluation from becoming central to the child's psychology? The truth of the matter here is the child has been successful because the child did the work. So one way of approaching this might be to say, well done on getting your good grade. You got that grade because look what you did. Look at all the preparation you did. Look at all the reading that you did. Making it about the child's own process rather than simply saying you are worthy because of the grade alone. We should really acknowledge some of the process because, as we all know, practice makes perfect. Now, before we get too theoretical, and for the sake of time, I wanted to leave you with some tips that you might find useful. I guess it's a big discussion, but do you want your child, who is different, to fit in or to stand out? I ask this because if we try to work with your child to find out what they like, rather than project what we like onto them, they will find a sense of purpose that is theirs, rather than just a copy of ours, a carbon copy of ours. And this will help them to realise their own potentials. I like this image because it reminds me a lot of my own childhood. I remember being the only boy on the bench at school believing I can't do that because I'm deaf. Now, I really wish that somebody would have explored the evidence for these core beliefs that I had obviously created for myself. And this is something that we can do using something called Socratic dialogue. Now, remember the 9-year-old girl that I spoke about earlier? She was genuinely fearful of further bullying, but by forcing them to go without processing the beliefs that were behind the reasons not to go, we do risk traumatizing them further. So I think developing that Socratic dialogue is really important so that children feel heard rather than forced to be social for the sake of being social. And why shouldn't we be proud of our kids? Why shouldn't the kids be proud? Through informal exposure therapy, you can ensure that your children are better and help them to meet a diverse range of people. This will prepare them for fitting in all kinds of social situations. I think it's important to emphasise early on that the only thing that we have in common is that we all are different. We can do that by exposing our children to a diversity of people. We can share stories. We can use stories from our own history, our own colleagues and friends that we've met that are different. Emphasising that early on will normalise the child's experience. While we know that receiving a diagnosis of hearing loss is a very distressing time, it's important to take the time to grieve. But wrapping your child up in cotton wool long term will result in something called poor individuation. Poor individuation results in children that are clingy, and they may grow up to have a constant need for validation. And this can result in personalities where indecision and anxiety is very prevalent. So I guess from here, of course, grieve, but also think about when might be the right time to bring in strategies to aid the child in their own development. We also need to be aware of projective statements such as you should and you ought, because in therapy, much time is spent undoing that. Okay? Why should your children? Why ought they? Just because you did? Remember, you are not them and they are not you. In cognitive behavioural therapy, the shoulds and the oughts are the most common unhelpful thinking style. And I guess for this, we're looking at exploring the why behind any reasons why children are told that they should and they ought. Quite often, we are chastising children, sometimes a bit too much. And that can be evidence of any shame or any stigma that you might have. And I'm wondering, does your shame need to become your child's shame? Does your anger need to become your child's go-to emotion? Remember, emotions are learnt. So should your fears for the future become your baby's fears? Deaf kids already feel different, so do your bit to minimise shame and guilt by avoiding confrontation, admonishing and humiliating. If, as a parent, you feel the need to do these things, I would explore this in therapy, because sometimes anger from our own childhoods can be feeding into the way we treat our children, which is not just projection, but also displacement of anger. Try your best also to develop the ability to be still and alone and leading by example, because if we are always on our phones or our technology, this sends out the message that it's okay for your child to be on their phone or their technology. Lead by example. It's okay to not have anything to do. In fact, one of the recommended readings is about boredom and how we need to be bored more in order to access our more creative selves. Tell your children about famous deaf people. You've got those in history such as Helen Keller, Thomas Edison, who invented the light bulb, all the way through to current role models such as TV stars and models. We also need to look at the roles that conceding and advocating play. If we concede too often, it means that we're not getting our needs met. So if a child learns to advocate quite early for themselves because you led by example, that would be the best place to leave the child. So conceding versus advocating and what that teaches your child. Now, we've covered quite a lot in this session. I just hope that some of the concepts here were useful. And of course, I'm available to book a session if you would like to explore any of these topics more. Now, these are some of the services that I offer. I am a qualified therapist. I'm recognised by the British Association of Counsellors and Psychotherapists, and I'm also recognised by the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society. Now, as parents, you're doing a great job with your kids. But if there are any themes that have come up in this session that you think would be good to explore, you can connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram, or visit my websites at stuartmcnaughton.com or thecochlearimplancoach.com. And for those of you who are interested in diving a little bit deeper on what we've discussed today, I will be doing a free workshop for parents. It's just continuing the same theme. I'll be introducing another couple of theories. It's on January the 18th in 2024. It will be on Zoom and it will be at 7 p.m. UK time. If you click on the QR code, that will take you to a registration page. So please register and I will see you then. Okay. Thank you very much for listening for the last half an hour. I do hope you found it useful, and please reach out if you need any support. Take good care for now. Bye.